I want to take kind of like a historical approach to recognizing, how these traditions come about. And first of all, we want to recognize that when we're speaking about food, we're speaking about this idea of a cuisine. A cuisine, of course, coming from a French word, which at the same time means kitchen and it means culture. And the understanding behind it is recognizing that when we speak about a cuisine, it's a way of doing things, it's a perspective, it's an understanding of how to not only prepare meals, but how to prepare the events in which these meals are celebrated and such. So again, we want to recognize that we're speaking about food culture. And culture, again, is a very complicated idea when we think about it, because it gets expressed in materiality, it gets expressed in event and behavior, it's anchored within communities, and it's very much contextualized. So I hope that, today, with this session that we have together, we could look at those aspects and really come to understand the deep-rooted nature of why food is important to us. And as another manner of prefacing, I'd like to make an elaborated land acknowledgement statement. And part of that, you may be familiar, is to recognize that the lands that we're on here in New Mexico, in Las Vegas in particular, are the historical lands of Tanoan people, the Pueblo people, Apache, Comanche, Dene, Ute, Kiowa peoples. And so I want to recognize that, these are our ancestors, and in this case, they've left vestiges and pamphlets of their lifestyles and their tradition that we could look at in our if we look deep enough, are going to be inserted within different kind of food traditions and foodstuffs that we have. So I'd like to think that the whole of this presentation is a more elaborated land acknowledgement statement, because I want to go that direction and say, let's go way back, because when we're talking about food, we also want to at the same time speak about the region and speak about bioregionalism as an academic direction, which speaks about how do humans interact with their landscape. And it comes out of a lot of different disciplines, environmental geology, social ecology, environmental psychology, cultural studies. There's a lot of different disciplines that wish to work with this idea of place identity, and inserted this idea on place identity and place identity formation is the behaviors that include food. So kind of what I want to jump ahead in with this thesis is kind of suggesting, by our partaking of foodstuffs and food tradition that have been around for more than hundreds of years, maybe millennia, we are automatically inserting ourselves within the place, within the landscape, within the bioregion in which we find ourselves and wish to incorporate ourselves further. Now, part of my research and part of my dissertation work was dealing with narrative formation of place identity. And I want to go a little bit with that, with this idea that, we create stories about being part of a place. And one of the best efforts that we use in becoming part of a place is partaking in the foods of that place. And therefore, food tradition is not just a behavior, it's not following a recipe and having a real nice meal. It's really a part of an identity formation, insertion of one's cultural identity within local cultural activities. And so for that matter, it kind of requires, it asks of us that we look at, again, part of the history of the region and where have all these different kind of cultural and culinary contributions come into place. And hopefully it kind of makes sense at the end that when we look at what I have a listing from New Mexico Magazine of top New Mexico foods, and we're going to kind of go through that list and deconstruct a little bit of them. But I want to start off, and I'll try to be real quick with this, is doing a real big history, because if you, at least you will be familiar with the big history, you're not going to recognize all these different food tradition influence that are coming to place. So I'm going to jump back and forth between a screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation. And again, so here we are. And again, to support this idea of culture embedded in place and contextualized. I use this map. Again, one of my responsibilities here at Highlands is working with the Native American Hispano Cultural Studies program. And this is one of the introductory images that we use in the sense of looking at when we speak about cultural areas. These are Native American cultural areas. And so it suggests to us that we want to understand that regional culture is embedded in landscape and topography. That culture is representative of landscape, topography, and local bioregionalism. So one of the points that I'd like to make is when you look at what's considered as a southwestern cultural area, it extends way down into central Mexico area. The area that we consider to be southwestern culture includes a big area, and it doesn't stop at the border. And for our intentions, we're right about here. We're on a border area. If you can figure that this isn't just the Rio Grande, but we're here in Las Vegas, San Miguel County. We're at a place where the mountains meet the plains, and so therefore that means something, because it's a shift in topography, a shift in landscape, and accompanying cultural patterns and cultural traditions, and particular food traditions that go along with it. So many of you may be familiar that this area for tens of thousands of years had been inhabited, first of all, by Paleo-Indian, and that's the terminology we use this day. They certainly went by a lot of names and self-identification areas. There were many nations, many tribes, but we kind of lump them all together under this category of Paleo-Indian. And they're best known as being nomadic hunter-gatherer people. But in the hunting tradition, they were big game hunters. And in that big game, they hunted mammoth, they hunted a bison that's twice the size of our contemporary bison. So that hunting tradition as a food strategy, as a food tradition, is very much anchored in this place. It's been here for a long time. Now, again, we don't have the free range open or the opportunity to go pick up a spear as developed with lithic technology and go and hunt a mammoth, which is really hunting in the bigger sense. We think of hunting tradition, contemporary hunting tradition, as you have electronic equipment and spotting scopes and high caliber rifles, and it doesn't compare with the kind of hunting that was taking place 10 to 15,000 years ago. So there was a significant amount of meat protein that were in those diets, and it was necessary because they were traveling distances and moving around. But we also want to recognize that, again, much of that diet and much of that, again, and we could talk about, later on we'll jump in and say, well, when we speak about a paleo diet and paleo nutrition, this is actually where the reference is again, pre-agricultural foodstuffs. And so in the gathering tradition, these indigenous peoples, they gathered tubers and roots and tubers. They gathered nuts and berries, fruits, and were very intimate with their landscapes. We recognize this from archaeological record that indicates to us by means of, where we found encampments and looking at actually fecal material and disposed trash heaps as well. We find pollen counts from hundreds of different kind of foodstuffs that were part of their diet. So part of this time frame and this food tradition included a very, very strong articulation with their natural environment and understanding the foodstuffs. It wasn't limited, but actually exercised a large extent of the biodiversity of foodstuffs that were in place. And that's going to be important to us later on when we come back to kind of some contemporary discussions about where do our foods need to go in the direction of maybe looking at paleo, looking at biodiversity foundations for our foodstuffs. And I use this slide also to remind people that in New Mexico in contemporary practice, there may still be a lot of hunter gathering, particularly the gathering taking place anymore. And And I'm hoping everybody, you recognize these foodstuffs that I have here on image. Definitely this beautiful little nut right here is essential to any New Mexican diet, and finds its way into chocolates and fudges, coffees and pastries, and just something cool to eat while you're working. Okay, and that's piñon. This, of course, is capulin, chokecherry. Cota, I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with what cota tea is. It's sometimes called Navajo tea or Mormon tea, etc. But it's a medicinal, a pleasantly tasting medicinal. Um, that's very common. I have a lot of it in my backyard. It's along the streets. It's not uncommon to see me on 7th or 8th Street. I know the little pockets where cota grows. And so where I'm walking around in an abandoned lot picking weed, what looks to be picking weeds, I'm actually picking up some of this cota tea. This one, verdolaga, everybody, most people in New Mexico are familiar with that. In English, it's purslane, I think. Yeah, purslane. And of course, quelite is a green that's very common, and this in English is lamb's quarters. Now, of course, when these big traditions shifts over, when we see the advent and the determination of agriculture. So agriculture comes into place in New Mexico about 4,000 years ago, as from archaeological record. Now, there's a strong articulation, as I showed in that previous map, that articulation with what is now northern Mexico, contemporary northern Mexico, in Mesoamerica, which is the central and the southern part of Mexico. There's always been a historical connection and a foodstuff connection, an exchange that's gone on with what we now know as what we're calling New Mexico in the Southwest, with those northern states of Mexico going all the way down into the Valle of Anahuac, where Mexico City is right now. So there's been an articulation with them. And so we have determination that agriculture begins about 7,000 years ago in the Valley of Tehuacan in Puebla, the state of Puebla. Again, very significant agriculture to the degree that they developed it significantly well enough that they could have surplus crops to be able to afford specialization, urbanization, high level construction, pyramid building, and eventually in affording military forces. Well, to feed an army, you have to have a very significant agricultural system. Now, the better part of that agriculture, of course, is based on the three sisters. And so again, this is very significantly part of our New Mexico diet today. In fact, you add chocolate and chili to this, and that's it. We got it. We're set. You know, what more do you need? Like corn, beans, squash, chocolate, and chili. I don't know. I'm contented with that as well. But I expand into other areas. So the Three Sisters agriculture comes to New Mexico about 4,000 years ago and becomes a staple of indigenous diets. Now, not everybody may be familiar that the original corn, as teosinte, was a finger in size, and it took hundreds of years of domestication before we have it today in the different varieties, the different forms, and the different sizes that we have. I've seen corn that's almost 2 feet large. Some of them, you know, in the Midwestern states, again, where they're using corn for fodder, for animals, for livestock, and ethanol production. Some of those corn cobs are yay big, you know, 2 feet in length. So again, you know, a very nutritious crop. And the combination of corn, beans, and squash is a full rounded diet that complement each other. Now, in the bigger history, again, many of you may be familiar with our indigenous history, kind of categories indigenous groups by Anasazi, Hohokam, Mogollon cultures and such. Now, these were different from Paleo-Indian because these were all agricultural societies. They were farming communities that had started to establish themselves in sedentary villages and typically along river systems because they were using flood irrigation and other systems. And a key example of this is the understand, what had taken place in Chaco Canyon. Now, throughout my presentation, and I am keeping an eye on my time to make sure I don't overdo it with the amount of information I'm providing. There's some key themes that I want to work with, and within these key themes, it's this understand of how our food traditions have been impacted by trade, exchange, and particularly in these kind of border areas, the border area between different cultures, where it isn't just a limitation where one culture stops and another begins, but rather the exchange and the energy, the trade and the exchange that takes place there lends for dynamic new compositions, um, and new constructions. So that idea that, again, much of our food tradition, like much of our culture, is socially constructed when people of different cultures and different kind of traditions are coming together. So it's not just stagnant, and it's been like this all the way throughout our history and such, but all these different kind of influence come into play and are visible within our tables and in our restaurants and such. So again, part of the ideas that I want to emphasize is this idea of trade and exchange, of multiculturalism in the sense of different kind of food traditions coming into play. And oftentimes those food traditions kind of match with each other with different forms of economic differences or power inequities, and therefore some of these food traditions are demonstrative of resistance efforts as far as maintenance of cultural identity and such. And much of this presentation again is anchored within the historical periods that are meaningful. Now again, this is Chaco Canyon, and if you're not familiar with it, this is a World Heritage Site up there between Cuba and Farmington. It's a New Mexico treasure. Everybody should visit it once or twice or three times a year to just embrace the knowledge, the culture that was there. Tremendous. And so Chaco is known for being an exchange center, a ceremonial center, a networking center, and just a vortex of power and energy that's in the middle of the desert there in northwestern New Mexico. Now, this was the Las Vegas, this was the Los Angeles, this was the stock market of the Southwest from the years 900 up until about 1200 and so. So for 300 years, there was significant exchange of people coming in throughout this area. And again, they were using Three Sisters agriculture, but they were trading away for foodstuffs that were coming from away. It was just within the last few years that they determined that there was a significant chocolate exchange, cacao that was found in Chaco Canyon. So they were bringing chocolate, cacao, all the way up from Mesoamerica, from central Mexico. In exchange, there's macaw feathers there's turquoise and onyx and flints from all other parts. So again, this was an exchange area where a lot of exchange had taken place. And part of that exchange was in food traditions and such. Now here in San Miguel County, we have the ruins. The Pecos ruins this is an artist's rendition of what Pecos Pueblo might have looked like several hundred years ago when it was at its peak, and it was called Secuye. And this was a beautiful area because it was an area where exchange was taking place. So you had, again, what I was talking about earlier, this border food tradition as far as Plains Indians coming in with buffalo pelts and buffalo hide and buffalo meat and trading for what the agricultural indigenous peoples, the Pueblo people, had. These are cornfields in the back, so corn, beans, squash, and this is a turkey in here, a guajolote. Again, dog and dog meat wasn't uncommon as far as demonstrated remains. So again, different kind of sources, but this is the kind of exchange that we're talking about that are historically part of New Mexico history. So again, agricultural tradition has been in place for 4,000 years. And at the time of the next level of exploration and conquest, when the Spanish come in, there had been significant agricultural tradition, which also benefited from the carryover of the hunter-gatherer food traditions that had preceded them and gave them foundation as well. in foodstuffs and knowledge of plant material and food material. So when the Spanish come in, they follow these trade routes that have been in place, not only from Zuni and from Chaco Canyon, but from this trade route that extended from Mesoamerica all the way up into the Pueblo areas. So the Spanish, on one expedition, the Cabeza de Vaca expedition, which you could see here with this green line, these were 4 individuals that were actually lost, and they found their way wandering into the Southwest and eventually made their way back to Mexico to tell these beautiful tall tales of what was up here in the Southwest, including fictional tales of cities made of gold, the cities of Cibola. But along with this expedition of Cabeza de Vaca, they had a chronicler, scribe, that wrote down of all the different kind of, almost a pre-ethnographic analysis of the indigenous groups that they met and lived with for a while, because they wandered around 8 years lost. And so they speak about the shaggy cows and the foodstuffs that were here in these areas, at least with what is now Texas, the indigenous groups that were in Texas, make their way back to Mexico, tell the story, and it sponsors a variety of other expeditions coming to the Southwest, including Marcos de Niza, and eventually the Coronado expedition, which is one of the first primary expeditions that comes into the area to look for gold and look for establishment. So again, they're following trade routes where they extended food. And actually, in one article I read, an author was calling it the Cocopelli Trail, because if you're not familiar, Cocopelli, the hunchbacked flute player that's so prevalent within our Southwestern culture and New Mexico culture in particular, that icon, you could find it on everything from keychains to tattoos to bumper stickers, and it's a well-known icon. And of course, it's a spiritual symbol. It's a deity within indigenous religion. It goes way back. Cocopelli was a seed giver. He was a fertility god, and he brought seeds. So part of the interpretation is this is what brought the seed from Mesoamerica and brought it into the Southwest to be able to sponsor the Three Sisters agriculture in the Southwest. So next time you're eating an enchilada, thank Cocopelli as an ancestor or a deity, as having been the one to bring the seed to New Mexico. So again, speaking about the Spanish exploration, Coronado comes in, and one of the interesting stories is suggested that when Coronado came in that expedition, which was more than 2 miles long, they lost animals along the way. So they lost some horses, lost some pigs, lost some sheep, which piqued not only the interest, but it piqued the palate of some of the indigenous groups that were around them. So indigenous people kind of started catching on. They didn't know who the Spanish were, but eventually they were left with some of the vestiges. And one of the important agricultural products that was left behind from the Coronado expedition were actually watermelon seeds. So by the time Oñate comes up, some 50 years later, many of the Pueblo villages had very significant watermelon production, and some of because they already had squash, but they didn't have melons. So the Oñate expedition comes up in 1598 and is reflective of this larger exchange. And if you're familiar with what this is called, the Columbian Exchange, it's the relationship and the exchange between old world cultigens and new world foods. And oftentimes we don't recognize this as, what were the foods that were indigenous, that were native to the Americas. Some of that deeply impacted European economies and made for world cuisines to place. So from the Americas, you have turkey, you have pumpkin, tobacco, quinine, different forms of sweet potatoes. In South America, there's over 260 varieties of potatoes that are still placed. Again, pineapple, different kinds of peppers, chili peppers, cacao for chocolate, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, beans, vanilla, some of these very important foodstuffs that are still part of our contemporary diet. were shipped to Europe and impacted those cuisines over there in Europe. And of course, what the Spanish brought with them was coffee, peaches, pears, apricots, citrus, olives, bananas, sugarcane, honeybees, onion, garlic, all the grains of wheat, rice, barley, and oats, and root crops, turnips, radishes, grapes, lettuce, and cabbages, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, here, as you could see, they brought disease with them, which also disseminated much of the American population. But the livestock they brought, heavily impacted what we now know as our Southwestern culture, particularly sheep, cattle, pigs, horses, and chickens as well. Okay. So one of the traditions, and again, without going too far into the heavy nature of our New Mexico history, is recognizing that the Spanish introduced some of these foodstuffs, and to some degree by forced indigenous populations into modifying their nutrition into their diet. Now, after an 80-year period, this turns out to sponsor part of the revolt of the Pueblo peoples. And in 1680, there's a revolt that centered here in northern New Mexico, and it kicks the Spanish out for a 12-year period. So when the Spanish come back, of course, we could speak a lot as to, what was the meaning and what were the events that led up to the Pueblo Revolt. What we want to focus on is what happens afterwards, that when the Spanish come back, they institute a different kind of policy there. They do call it the Reconquest, the Reconquista. But when they come back, one of the differences is that their emphasis is on land grant repartimiento system, a different system of land tenureship that allows for small farming and small ranching developments. And they anchor this not only in the tradition of the acequia systems, which again are very ancient traditions for irrigating lands. And it's not even Spanish. It was the Berbers got them from the Mesopotamians, the Moors got them from the Berbers, the Spanish got them from the Moors, and eventually translated this technology and these traditions into the New World. And here in New Mexico, they took place and seriously transferred our landscapes. In fact, we speak a lot about acequia culture in New Mexico as being a culture of exchange and collaboration and deep-rooted ideas on land stewardship and such. So those give us different kind of events and functions by which we recognize where these food traditions are going to be anchored. Because food and food exchange and food sharing happens during events, and these events become very, very important when we recognize how important our food traditions are. So it's not the food itself, but the preparation, the preservation, the story, the cultural perspective, and the context, the events in where we do food sharing that really lends for this larger understanding of cuisine and food tradition and such. So let me finish up with some of my big history. This is a depiction of an acequia community, whereas water is diverted, creating the agricultural fields. This is Taos Valley acequia systems, over 72 acequias in place. And what do we have as a result? We have beautiful production. Again, we will talk about Chile because Chile is so much Nuevo Mexicano, and very much a part of New Mexico identity, as well as our foodstuffs and such. But I wanted to bring these images in here, and we'll talk about these foodstuffs as well. Now, this is Vristra chili, as you may be familiar, green, red, new, mature. And I threw this one here just for the fun of it. Well, not for the fun of it, with intention. This is Colorado Mirasol chili that grows in Pueblo, Colorado. And it's one of the varieties of northern New Mexico chili varieties that are very much within our farms and our ranches and our refrigerators and our stomachs as well. But so again, I wanted to go through that real big history and just kind of remind people that we've had a lot of different kind of cultural influences coming into place. Some of them with a colonizing or an idea of conquest, and other influences that are more so exploratory. As an example, when the Santa Fe Trail comes into place, it introduces again a different kind of market, whereas New Mexico communities, these land grant acequia communities that were kind of somewhat almost sovereign kinds of communities of one another. When the Santa Fe Trail comes in and there's a need for exchange with some of those goods, much of this produce starts to leave the state in exchange for products that are coming in through the Santa Fe Trail. Eventually, we have the railroad coming into place as well. And with the railroad, that significantly transforms the area economically as well as gastronomically as well. With the railroad coming into place, that's where you see the big end development of the cattle trade, the cattle industry. There had been cattle and sheep herding since the Spanish, but it really takes off when the railroad comes into place, and cattle ranching becomes contentious with sheep ranching, but nonetheless grows to the becomes in some areas monopolized, and it causes war and skirmish, et cetera, et cetera. But you have a very significant protein, beef protein insertion within our diets as well. And again, other instances, that one of the important factors is when the Harvey restaurants and the Harvey hotels start coming in as accompanying parallel to the railroad. You have again a different kind of cuisine that's coming in. Some of that's embracing local cuisine and local food tradition, but also adding new elements and bringing new ideas into how to make these combinations come about. Again, the development of Route 66 as a tourist traveling venue significantly impacts much of local restaurants and local cuisine, because again, there's interest in bringing foods from the outside that New Mexicans are not familiar with, and also people that are coming through New Mexico becoming familiar with the foodstuffs that are here. And one of the things that we want to emphasize is the idea that, much of New Mexico cooking certainly benefits from the Spanish and from Mexican influence, particularly the border influence. But we also consider that New Mexico cooking, because of that long-standing historical tradition, and because of the exercise of using foodstuffs from these particular bioregions of the high arid desert and the mountains and the water system, we have some particulars to our foodstuffs that are different than Mexico. And again, so Southwestern cuisine, Chicano cooking, indigenous cooking, it may be very, very particular to areas as well. Again, one of the areas that becomes important is when refrigerated cars start showing up on the railroad, because that's when you could actually start bringing seafood to New Mexico. We're landlocked. We're away from the ocean, so our seafood is salamanders and trout from the rivers and such. So once we get red snapper in place, it changes around a lot of the different kind of cuisines, etc. Again, I mentioned the idea that the Texas cattle industry really contributes more and more. After World War II, because many of our veterans had the ability and had the venue to go out and experience a bigger world, they're coming back with some of those tastes, so some of those interests in other areas. So not radically, but it significantly starts changing some of the cuisine that's in New Mexico restaurants and such, because again, there's an adherence to a tourist market and not just feeding our own. With the development of big franchise sort of fast foods, that of course is going to have an impact. McDonald's gets established in the 1950s. We don't have them here in New Mexico, but eventually In-N-Out Burger has a bearing We have Blake's Lotta Burger, which has been around for a long time, and of course gets world famous because they make the claim to have invented the green chili cheeseburger. But again, all these different influences that come into place is, economic changes, political changes, and certainly when we include after World War II, the in-migration of different kind of ethnic groups, including Lebanese and now Jewish conversos have been part of New Mexico cuisine and contribution for a long time. We see delicatessens start showing up, bagel industries, et cetera, et cetera. German immigrants coming into the Southwest bring their traditions as well. In fact, kind of the idea that chicken fried steak is a German import, that it's very much similar to Wiener Schnitzel. Okay, our proximity to Texas and actually African American communities coming in after the Civil War, coming into New Mexico, looking for employment and opportunity, bringing with them. So we have barbecue tradition, and I'm not sure if everybody's familiar that barbecue is very, very, very precise in the cuisine itself. You have Memphis, Carolina style, you have Memphis style, you have Kansas City style barbecue, and Texas style barbecues, and there's very strict parameters as to how those are framed and how the cuisine presents itself. So again, we have a lot of different kind of influences coming into place, but the tendency is to recognize that New Mexico food tradition tends to go back to that mixing between indigenous foodstuffs and the introduction of the food items that came with the Spanish expedition. So let's start talking about this a little bit more and looking at where that top 20 is at. And I want to emphasize this idea that this is part of the social construction of food tradition, is recognizing that there's an exchange, and it's not, you don't have to follow the recipe to benefit from New Mexico food traditions. Recipes are there as guides, but you get to explore, you get to, experiment and play with things as well. And so consequently, there's creativity, there's a dynamic, there's new ideas and new concoctions that come about when we start playing with it. And when we start speaking about the nouveau New Mexico cuisine, which we see in a lot of our, many of our restaurants in Santa Fe and Taos and Albuquerque, Español and such, their explorations, they're still using New Mexico traditional foodstuffs, but in unique and new types of configurations. I was looking for the image right before we started. I was going to throw it in with my slide presentation. Has anybody tried the green chili milkshake on the Route 66 casino? Thumbs up. Fish tacos, they're not traditional. Sushi tacos, yeah, it's happening in the Southwest. We have sushi and kimchi tacos. There's a lot of new kind of combinations that are coming to place because we have all these influences coming in place, and including supermarkets that bring this foodstuffs that we don't have to rely on locally produced fare. And that eventually becomes a discussion as to how much foodies and how much locavores emphasize that they're going to eat locally on a continual basis, because oftentimes that means there's limitations on seasonality as far as foods coming into place. So again, commercial trucking, refrigeration has allowed us to expand into global cuisine, but at the same time, is that coming at a cost to our local cuisine, in particular our local food producers? But anyway, so New Mexico Magazine, top 20 New Mexico foods. Green chili cheeseburgers, chiles rellenos, red and green chili, carne adobada pork, stacked red chili enchiladas. Adam, I'm doing this purposely to get you more anchored, if you're still out there. Remind you that you didn't eat lunch. Huevos rancheros, blue corn, tamales, tortillas, chicharrones, chicos, pozol, beans, calabacitas, horno bread, Navajo fry bread, sopapillas. And I got to make a little note on that one because it's a real interesting one that we would have Navajo fried. Did I catch your interest, Adam? That we would have Navajo fry bread on that because again, there's a kind of a dubious history that goes along with it. If many people are familiar with the Navajo Long Walk when the U.S. Cavalry marched the Navajo community from the Four Corners area out to Fort Summer in the east, and many people died along the way. Once they had them stationed there in somewhat of a concentration camp, the limited foods that they gave them were flour and lard. And from that, we see this fry bread tradition, Navajo tacos, being born because, again, and this is a really interesting combination because when we think about Native American foodstuffs in New Mexico, we think of mutton stew. Mutton wasn't indigenous. Mutton came with the Spanish. And fry bread is out of wheat flour and lard from pork that came with the Spanish. So even what we see as Native American foods in New Mexico, it's kind of that mestizaje, that exchange with the Spanish system that brings about. So things, as much as things remain the same, they do change, et cetera, et cetera. But let me finish up. So also part of my listing is Navajo fry bread, sopapillas, piñón, and bizcochitos. You gotta have a meal. And again, so many of those foodstuffs are, again, like I mentioned, are not only anchored in context and tradition and event, but that's part of where the significant sharing comes about. I wanted to do a little, just a couple more slides, okay? Again, this idea of food traditions are anchored in place, and sometimes with certain kind of areas of equipment, as you are familiar, the horno, this ubiquitous structure that's in many people's backyards and in indigenous pueblos, again, is a marvelous cooking device that has a certain kind of physics to it that make for excellent food cooking, et cetera, et cetera. And you don't find them that much outside of the Southwest. I bring into let me do this one. This one is a matanza, and again, I'm so pleased that Highlands University we're reinventing the idea of doing a matanza, not only as a cooking event but as a celebration of community. The idea of the matanza is again to a cambalache, a repartimiento, where you're feeding your neighbors. You're doing it as a community event. And so we've done this. This is one images of some of the ones that we do with our Mecha student organization. Actually, we've done this before with Mecha, Native American Club, Political Science Club, Conservation Club. We've all done collaborations in doing it, including certainly pork and sheep and cabrito, borreguita. And these are images of some of the ones that we've done at Highlands University as a community event. So this is a chicharron pot. This is the 400 plus pounds of pork and beef roast that we put and cooked into this pit after an assembly line of workers made all the reparations and then celebrated it on a day when we invited community to come in and share with the foodstuff. Really, really good cooking, really good sharing going on. So again, this idea that when we speak about food, it's not just follow the recipe, it's not just calculate the ingredients. It's really understanding that food tradition is embedded within ideas on exchange, convivencia, the idea that people share and change. And in fact, many of us recognize that the heart of a house is the kitchen. And that's not out of irony. It's because food tradition as anchored in there, as it sponsors communication, as it sponsors exchange, as it sponsors sometimes conflict because you added too much salt, or no, you should use this pepper rather than this pepper. Within my family, I know I could cause strife if I start questioning a cooking method, and that different family members say no, this way, this way, this way, like that. Again, it's a social construction is what happens. But anyway, I apologize for lending so much, giving so much information from the historical, but I think it's important for us to recognize these historical events as they have bearing and have vestige in what we understand as our food traditions. But let's open it up. We have a little bit of time of question, answer, and comment, please. We could have done a survey to do that top 10 and top 10 food stuff and see what. Okay, Priscilla Ortega. Yeah, that's verdolaga, purslane verdolaga. And it's actually not a native crop to the Americas, but it's very, very prevalent within our backyards. It's good eating. Try some with beans, and again, you're going to find cookbooks have 101 different recipes for verdolaga. I was raised on shakewe as a kid, so that one would have made my top 20. Okay, cabrito, let me respond to that one because cabrito. Oh, Dr. Garcia, hey. Okay. So one of the ones is cabrito. Again, where I grew up, I'm from northern Mexico, northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. It's all the same thing. Yeah, I was raised more with proteins coming from sheep and goat. You know, we had we would get a deer or an elk every once in a while, but most of our meat protein was coming from sheep and goats and such. So there's a variety of different areas. As an example, is everybody's familiar with birria? Birria is kind of border culture, border cooking. But for me, that's the manner of how to prepare cabrito. You could do it on an open spit, you could do a pit cook on it, etc. There's 101 ways to do cabrito, and you might see this in these different types of matanzas. Yeah, verdolagas are very healthy. I agree with you, Jonis. Spinach and quelite are different species. Quelite in English is lamb's quarters. If anybody has a verbal question, we still have a little bit of time. We got a couple minutes, so you're not limited to chat. Can we do that, Julie? Is unmute if people have a question?
Yeah, just go ahead and unmute yourselves. Now's a good time. Absolutely. Yeah, I actually read that that the white ish on the leaves of the wild spinach, so to speak, is a mineral that's really, really great for you. So don't try to wash that stuff off. And you probably know much more about this than I do, Dr. Romero.
Been eating it all my life in a variety, and it makes for a good salad as well. And so, David, and let me speak to this idea of chili addiction. Okay, so you may be familiar that down in southern New Mexico is the Chili Institute in Las Cruces, and they were pioneers in developing out something called the Scoville scale, which was the manner of how to determine the amount of capsaicin, the picante that's in a chili. You could measure it. So on a scale, this Scoville scale measures how hot the chili is. A bell pepper, again, doesn't have capsaicin, so it's 0 on the scale. A jalapeno is something kind of like 10,000, a serrano's 15,000 units per gram. On that same scale, a habanero pepper is 100,000 units per gram. So which is to say a habanero pepper is 10 times as picante as a jalapeno. And of course, you have these crazy chilies that have been played around with ultimately, and I challenge you to eat them raw. just because I'm massive. I'm mean. David, you got a question? Yes.
Dr. Romero, excellent presentation. It's good to see you. I'm out enjoying the last warm day, I guess, outside. But I wanted to ask you about also the importance of the cosechas of sal. I know people going to making pilgrimages to the different salt sites around the state.
Good. I'm glad you brought that up, and I probably should have mentioned it within the Chaco Canyon component, because at Chaco there was a salt exchange, and part of it is they were, again, those trade routes were happening not only north and south but east and west. There's some significant salt deposits outside of El Paso, and in fact, when the territory becomes the United States after a war of conquest, there's contention because the salt fields outside of El Paso, Texas, were part of this idea of common lands, of ejido lands, and people had open access. And then it gets commercialized into the degree that people start appropriating the salt fields. But there's been exchange of salt that comes in New Mexico, first of all, as sponsored by the Chaco Canyon trade routes, and eventually along that route of the Camino Real, particularly the salt coming out of El Paso. Not necessarily the hotter the temperature. The amount of capsaicin that shows up in chili is from a variety of different factors. Like, for instance, you go buy a sack of chili, and from the store, and they say this is hot, but you get some, it's not as hot as such. It could be in fact idiosyncratic to individual plants that share the same genetics, but the micronutrients that show up in soil and such may have a bearing. So not necessarily the hotter the temperature that's growing. As an example, I mentioned the Mirasol chili that comes down from Colorado. There's a chili up there as well that comes out from the Four Corners area that's called Chile Lumbre. And that Lumbre chili is high, but even though it's grown at higher elevation in color level. Now remember, there's three key questions that go along with chili, right? Red or green, chili with an E or chili with an I. And for me, I want to rephrase this question, that the question isn't really making the comparison of New Mexico chili versus Colorado chili. I kind of like to reframe the question and say, the question is Southern New Mexico chili versus Northern New Mexico chili. Industrial farming techniques versus small agricultural family types of level farms, and the higher elevation, the food stuff. We've had some interesting discussions with that here on campus when we do our chili roast. But of course, chili is a conversation item. It's a cultural item, and you got to have it. Now, again, because of the capsaicin, now chili, again, to eat chili, remember, it's high in A, B, C, E vitamins. It's an antioxidant. It boosts your metabolism. It releases endorphins. And the hotter the chili, the more endorphin response that you have. So basically, it's not dissimilar to morphine in that you bite into a hot chili, your brain releases a pain reliever that calms you down. So you actually kind of get high with the higher level chilies. And along with a high, you could have an addiction. You could actually form a chili addiction from needing that capsaicin to do the endorphin release in your brains.
So, what about chili piquin? Where does that come from, or piquin?
Oh, okay, this is when I have arguments with my wife. Piquin in New Mexico, we speak of piquin as a kind of a form, a level of ground of the chili itself. It's a little bit more larger. It's more flakes rather than powder. But piquin is also a chili species in and of itself. It's little they're little bolitas. Piquin is a little bolita chili. which the original chilies, again, chilies is indigenous to the Americas. We have them from the higher Bolivia and Colombia, Mesoamerica, etc. And some of the ones that they grew in South America were these little bolita chilies, and related to the Pekin of what we know. So we say Pekin not because of species, but a kind of grind that we use for our red chili.
So what is that small chili pod? That's not a Pekin?
Well, there's a chiltepin. Chiltepin is also a small little bolita. And again, you know, in the American, now here in the Southwest, at most we use maybe 11 to 12 different species of chilies. In Mexico, they cook with as many as 70 to 80 different varieties of chilies. And including Mexico and Central America and such, there may be as much as 150 different varieties of chili. Again, you know, it's domesticated as according to region and such. And certainly when we have the Chili Institute in New Mexico, and Fabian Garcia and other entities that started experimenting with chili strains way back in the 30s, when they decided that they wanted to produce it for marketability in a larger commercial market. Again, they started exploring many of these different kind of strains and strands, and eventually not necessarily species, but different strains of chili, and part of it is for the marketability. But that's why I'm saying, for me, the northern New Mexico, our heirloom chilies are maybe not as important for the economics of New Mexico, but certainly from these identity and cuisine areas. My preference is in northern New Mexico mountain chilies. And of course, there's chilies that are coming in from out of other areas of the country. Thai chili, you know, the chilies that are used for sriracha itself, those are chili forms that get developed in other areas. And again, has anybody tried a ghost pepper? Ghost pepper on that Scoville scale is more than a 1 million unit, 1.2 million units per gram. So it makes it 100 times hotter than a jalapeno.
Wow.
It burns your fingers when you work with them. It burns your eyes just looking at them. Morcillas, Nina, I see that menudo, and what we understand is blood pudding or morcillas. That didn't make the top 10 list on the New Mexico. Again, you know, tripitas didn't make the list. There's a lot of what's historically considered as enteral meat or discarded meat. We have a way of, you know, within indigenous and Hispanic communities, we make delicacy out of them as well. So nothing gets wasted. I wish we could extend our session so that we could more talk about differences in recipes and different cuisines. And like I say, now important to New Mexico identity, and my colleague, Dr. Erica Durkis, who's written on, you know, Chile and New Mexico identity, she frames it that, again, is somewhat of a kind of a resistance effort when we defend the importance of chili within our food, and that, you know, you could eat chili with pancakes if you want. You put it in candy, you put it in jelly, you put it in your alcohol and so many different things. But part of it is this idea that our cuisine, because it came from an enclave community, and that enclave community had been disenfranchised within the rest of the United States for a lot of different reasons. And so therefore, our maintenance and our adherence to a tradition of local foodstuffs, and our interest in continuing with it and defending it, is kind of a resistance to larger commercializations and assimilation, colonization efforts. So it's not out of irony that much of New Mexico foodstuffs and communities are going back to indigenous foodstuffs and identifying what are the native foodstuffs to our areas, and let's start emphasizing that, even if it is not developed as a commercial crop to go out of the state and not an economically feasible crop. Let's do it for us because we're deserving and we're tied and we're community. We collaborate, we work together, and we certainly share whenever the time is necessary. So again, Roxanne Swenzel and other different entities, Tiwa Women United, they've been doing a lot of work is looking at local cuisine and again, therefore I use that word of locavore in saying, can we come back to that? Because certainly if we're looking at larger areas, not only pandemic, but climate change, economic crisis, et cetera, we may need to be turning more and more locally. If you're not familiar, I'm going to show you a book. This is a beautiful book that I just recently read. Tortillas, Tejuina, and T-Bones, A Food History of the Southwest, Gregory McNamee. He started in his finalizing chapter, he starts talking about looking at the potential for us to go this direction of what's called tiny livestock, which is saying we may want to start, looking at those grasshoppers and grubs and little gusanos, not only in the manner of how they contribute to our local environment, but they could be excellent sources of protein as well. And again, deep in Mexico, and if you're not familiar, a good 60% of the world population continually use insects as part of their diet and such. And so if we could get past our initial stigmas and our cultural limitations on exploring different foodstuffs, we might actually find other different foodstuffs that are more economically and more ecologically balanced than some of our foodstuffs. Again, beef to raise beef causes has environmental circumstances and consequences and such. So as our foodstuffs start changing around, we may start looking at other different kind of combinations, is to say. I'm looking at the chili pepper encyclopedia. I'm not familiar with that, Priscilla. Thank you. Shane, good questions. Again, this is the thing is, for me, I think we're going to see a sharp split between the mass commercialism of New Mexico chili, and then I'm kind of almost willing to relegate that to the southern varieties, the Hatch chilies, the Socorro chilies, the lemon tart chilies. In fact, the chili that comes out of El Paso and Isleta Sur, because again, just the industrialized farming as well as is combination that if we could, I often in one of my classes, again, I have a spring class which is New Mexico Acequia, land grant acequia and reservation communities. And we do actually have a discussion in there is where does the best northern variety of chilies come about, but we have everybody not disclose that information outside of the classroom because sometimes we want to keep things as secrets. Bunny ad, yes, yeah. Because part of my educational background is in cultural linguistic anthropology, and my master's degree is from Mexico, and I got to do a lot of work with indigenous communities. So my listing of foodstuffs that I've tried is to some quite remarkable, to others it's somewhat disgusting, the foods that I've ate. But again, the strategy is always eat first and ask afterwards what it is. You might be surprised it's what you like. Any other questions or comments, please?
Have you heard of burruñates?
Oh, Buruñates, of course. You know, that didn't make the New Mexico listing of top 10.
No,
But
no,
again,
nobody do it.
see, this is the thing is that sometimes enteral meat and again, organ meat may not be in the connoisseur restaurant, you know. Actually, it is pate is made with liver, right? You know, there's different preparation. But buruñates is very common with the matanza that we do with mecha when we do a sheep or a goat. We do buruñates there, and again, ask people to try it. At least give it a try.
They're nice and crispy.
My wife likes her pipitas crispy, and so we went into restaurants and where she sent them back and say, please fry these a little bit more. Marty, Pauline, do you want to go ahead and explain what is a buruñate? We have a chat request.
Well, as I recall, it they took the intestines and then they wrapped it around and then deep
Pieces of
fried it.
fat,
But I don't know what they wrapped it around in. I can't remember that.
pieces of fat, chunks of fat.
Yes, and then they took the intestine and wrapped it all around and then deep fat fried it.
Yes, yum yum.
Like a potato chip.
No way, I would never eat that stuff.
Okay.
Oh, Miss Tina,
I don't know what you missed
do
on.
you eat hot dogs?
Not really, but only when I go wood cutting do I take hot dogs.
Okay, do you know what goes into a hot dog?
Oh
Tina?
yeah, I'm aware of that.
Everything.
So can you talk about maybe traditional food making with the blood from the cow or from the animal that's been butchered?
Yeah, well, in some sense that for us, I recognize that as being morcillas.
Mhm.
Morcillas is a blood sausage, or oftentimes when you have a slaughter of the animal, that blood, you have to decoagulate it, etc. But then when we do our matanza, we fry it up right there and make tacos out of it as well. But Tina, have you tried morcillas?
Well, I'll call you back, Tatiana. In Finland, when I was an exchange student in Finland, they cook a lot with the blood and they make blood pancakes. And they also do make blood sausage. They mix it with rice and then they go ahead and then they, I guess they deep fry it. But I didn't particularly care for it. However, they would serve the blood pancakes with a berry type of a berry sauce, a wild berry sauce from there. And the two actually complement each other quite well. Although I didn't really care for it, but it they complemented each other really good.
There's some really interesting discussions out there that speak about our palate, right? Because the palate, again, this idea that cuisine and culture are cognitions, their perspectives of seeing the world around you. And the more that we challenge where our perspective is, the more we could challenge the manner of how we receive stimuli. So you could kind of like, in essence, in a bumper sticker saying, you could change your taste around so that you enjoy foods that at first you don't like. You could, that's that growth mindset sort of orientation of adapting yourself. And this is what I say is like my educational background as an anthropologist, I was intentional about going after foods that I didn't know what they were to try them. And on very few occasions was I actually really disgusted or disgruntled with the food stuff that I tried and such. One time in Mexico, I ate a goose gut salad that just, I retched, I didn't like whatsoever. As much as I tried to prepare myself for it. And that's why I say, don't, if you get past that initial bias of, no, I'm not going to eat a grasshopper, and you try it and you kind of put in your mind that you're going to be open-minded about it, So you could actually make those kind of mental changes so that way your palate becomes less discerning and more accommodating to the foodstuffs that you try. And certainly now that we're going to be working with climate change and limited on the produce that we get coming into our stores, we may have to change the way around much and significantly our way of how, the foods that we eat and the availability of them as well. Like I say, foodie culture, there's a give and take with it, because in foodie culture, you're getting more specific, more particular, more eclectic with it. But at the same time, there's a willingness to try different kind of flavor combinations and different kind of cooking strategies, et cetera, et cetera. But again, in recognizing that in foodie culture, there's also a very significant movement towards looking at locale and looking at, again, particularly supporting local markets by purchasing local produce as well.
I got a question for you that's easier than typing it in. And you may have covered this, but I know I arrived late, I apologize. But, like traditional recipes, let's say even recipes from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, right? And because you have an overview, how do you see it as how much of that's even kind of reclaimable, right? Like how many species or ingredients have either been lost or changed beyond what they were 150 years ago, where you go, okay, well, I'm making this with the right ingredients, but it's not the same. Like even within people's lifetime memories of like, oh, I can't get the blood for the blood. It's hard to get blood. It's hard to get things like bone marrow and things like that, much less maybe plants that are no longer easily available. So what's your overview of how reclaimable the recipe heritage is?
Well, I think part of that is dealing with, again, one of the biggest things that did have an impact on local cuisine and local cooking was, again, the Piggly Wigglies, the Safeways, the Albertson stores as well, because suddenly by means of those socially engineered markets, you have such more variety of foodstuffs that you could look. So it's kind of, this novelty and exploration of I'm going to try these foods. I'm going to try these foods. And again, that, from an economic sense, so you have a lesser local production because there's not a market for these items. And because why I could get kiwi in December and strawberries in January, etc. So you don't have this reliance on local stuff, much less the seasonality that goes along with it. And again, this is kind of part of where that New Mexico tradition is that foodstuffs were eating not only for particular events, that you had a capirotada, a sopa for Quaresma, for the Lenten season, and then now in the harvest, this is when we're finishing up with our produce. Otherwise, we're looking at preservation. That whole kind of seasonal cycle has been disrupted because the availability of foodstuffs throughout the year. And so part of it is recognizing, saying, if we want to get to those recipes and those traditions, we also want to look at, again, the seasonality and the cycles that went along with it. Again, when does your choke cherry harvest happen? When does your sour cherries, when are those ready? When is the piñón ready as well?
Do you think, though, that a lot of that's disappeared? I mean, like, because I hear what you're saying, and like, for instance, like, because, butchery has been standardized and is done by supermarkets, how many cuts that used to be really as a result of the fact that you killed your cow and wanted to use all of it, can you even get anymore? Or like you say, like some of these vegetables, like, have some of the crops been so neglected they've essentially disappeared, and it'll be a lot of effort to even get them back to be able to start to try them, or to get non-standard cuts of meat because it's no longer self butchery and things like that. And that's maybe more of the question.
Well, the market responds to demand, right? So to the degree, if we start asking for those foodstuffs, perhaps let me give you a story. Outside about San Antonio, Texas, San Antonio, because at one time we was kind of like Denver. It was a regional slaughterhouse community, or a city where stock was taken for slaughter and such. So there was a little community that was called Las Tripitas, which was a Mexicano community that was a lot of the people that were working the matanzas, the slaughterhouses. And so the slaughterhouses themselves were not using some of these other foodstuffs like enteral meat or skins and this and that. And so they were throwing them. And so consequently, the workers were taking them home with that. And so that was their menudo, that was their tripitas, this and that. And they were they were eating well from it, because again, organ meat is highly nutritious as well. And so so the company started they caught on that, that the local population, the local communities were holding those foods, putting them on their table. So they started selling them. They discontinued from throwing or giving those foods away, and they marketed it. And so this Tripitas community, they were able to benefit, because once it got marketed, they had already established themselves as that's the place that you went to for menudo, for tripitas, for lengua, et cetera, et cetera. So at least they weren't devastated by the commercialization of that, which was a discarded meat store. But here in New Mexico, I think if to the degree that we start asking our providers, our markets, that these are the foodstuffs that we want, then again, they make them available. And of course, the idea is, well, we don't necessarily need to look at the stores, but let's look at the farmers market as them making those foodstuffs available as well.
Cool, thanks.
Pauline? Can't hear you. Ms. Rindon, we can't hear you.
I was muted. I'm okay now, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Did you ever participate in the Holy Thursday dinner with the yellow peas, dried peas, and chili? And I can't remember what the green stuff was, whether it was verdolagas and quelites or what, that they had preserved from before. Oh, I know what it was. They were called rueditas, and it was pumpkin that had been dried. So all of these were preserved foods.
Tasajo. Tasajo. Remember that word? Los tasajos de calabaza. Those are the dried and preserved. Yeah, again, so those are Quaresma meals, right?
Mm-hmm. Because you couldn't have meat. I still remember those yellow peas, dried peas. They were so good. They were better than pinto beans, I thought.
Yeah, lentejas. Within my family, we were eating lentejas.
They did that too.
And the thing is, lentejas is actually, it's a Spanish introduction.
Oh, okay.
We think of beans and split peas and that as being from the Americas. Well, beans are from the Americas, but lentejas and split peas are actually, I think they're from the Middle East and introduced by means of Spain.
Huh. Okay. Very interesting. Thank
Nina,
you
at your service. Nina, in your question, again, that was my running joke on bologna and hot dogs. There's a lot of organ meat that finds its way into processed meats. So it may not necessarily be that that organ meat is more common in third world countries. We just hide it a little bit more. And lenteja and alberjón are not the same thing. Alberjón are our sweet peas, and lentejas are lentils.
Lentils, yeah.
And we in the north we call them alberjones. In the south they call them chicharros.
Okay, I was gonna say alberjones, but I didn't know if you would know that word, because I hardly ever hear it anymore. But you had the dried yellow peas. Yeah. Well, I'm getting hungry anyway. fried
And
bologna.
yes,
Somebody-
fried bologna. Oh, I agree with that. I agree with that. I'm cool. I'm cool with spam too. Spam is always part of my hunt.
I agree with that too. Spam is way underrated.
Bye.
Spam is the best.
Okay, so if there is no other comment or question, Julie.
Oh, I don't see anything else. So I think we've made it all the way to potted meat. So that might be a good spot to.
That's food tradition, right?
to
Well, we'll not call it potted meat. We'll call it pate.
pate. There you go. So put the
Julia-
French twist on it, right?
I suspect you